The night air was cool and crisp in the small town of Troy, Missouri, where the houses sat closely together, each one a mirror of the next. In this seemingly peaceful neighborhood, everyone knew everyone else, and it was easy to assume that nothing could happen here that would disrupt the calm. But behind the quiet facades and neatly trimmed lawns, hidden truths were waiting to be revealed. Truths that would shake this tight-knit community to its core. Betsy Faria was just like any other woman living in the suburbs, a devoted wife, a loving mother, a woman who took pride in her family. She and her husband Russ had been married for over a decade. Together they had 2 teenage daughters, a dog, and a home that had been their sanctuary. Russ, who worked at a local insurance company, was a reliable if somewhat quiet man. On the surface, their lives seemed as typical as any other. But appearances can be deceiving. In the days leading up to Betsy's death, something was changing. It wasn't immediately obvious. These things never are, but Betsy was growing increasingly distant. She had always been outgoing, but recently she had been pulling away from her friends and family. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. She spent more time on her phone, less time talking to Russ, and when she did speak, there was a flicker of tension in her voice that wasn't there before. It was as if a part of Betsy, the carefree woman she once was, had disappeared, and as the days passed, her behavior became harder to ignore. One person who noticed the shift was Pam Hupp, Betsy's best friend, who had known her for years. Pam and Betsy had shared many conversations over cups of coffee, long walks, and late-night talks. But recently, Pam began to wonder if Betsy's marriage was in trouble. There were rumors, whispers really, that Betsy wasn't as happy as she once was, and that things at home weren't as perfect as they appeared to be. And yet, nobody could have predicted what would happen next. Pam, ever the confidant, offered Betsy an ear, a shoulder to lean on, and, unknowingly, an opportunity for something darker to unfold. Betsy and Russ had a complicated marriage, though nothing out of the ordinary for a couple who had been together for so long. Betsy's frustration with her life had begun to grow. She felt trapped, overwhelmed by the responsibilities of family life, and perhaps a part of her craved something more, a sense of freedom or excitement that had been missing from her world. Was she looking for a way out? Or was she just seeking solace in the wrong places? Whatever the reason, her behavior had changed, and Pam Hupp was right there beside her, listening to every word. But behind the facade of friendship, Pam harbored secrets of her own. Pam had a particular knack for blending into the background, becoming indispensable to those around her. She made herself seem like the perfect friend, offering emotional support when needed, and even playing a significant role in Betsy's life as a confidant. But unbeknownst to Betsy, Pam had been harboring feelings for someone in Betsy's life, someone she had no business being involved with. Pam had become entangled in a forbidden attraction, one that would ultimately prove to be deadly. As rumors about Betsy's marriage spread, so too did Pam's quiet obsession with Russ Faria, Betsy's husband. It was a quiet, slow burn, a secret that no one would notice until it was too late. Pam's growing feelings for Russ didn't stay hidden forever. One evening, Betsy caught wind of an unsettling moment. Russ and Pam had been acting strangely, a bit too friendly, a bit too intimate. Was it a harmless flirtation, or something more? Betsy's heart began to race. The friendship that had once been so comforting now felt treacherous, and she began to see something she hadn't before. A side of Pam that was much darker than she could have imagined. But just as Betsy started to sense that something was wrong, fate would intervene in the most tragic way possible. On December 27, 2011, Betsy Faria was found brutally murdered in her home. The scene was horrific. Betsy had been stabbed multiple times. Russ, who had been at home that night, was the one to find her. It seemed like a devastating act of violence, but the real shock came when Russ was arrested and charged with her murder. The investigation quickly turned towards Russ, and it seemed like an open and shut case. A husband who killed his wife in a fit of rage. But things weren't adding up. Russ maintained his innocence, and as the police began digging deeper, they would uncover a tangled mess of lies, manipulation, and deceit. What followed would be nothing short of shocking. Betsy's tragic death marked the beginning of a long and twisted journey for justice, one that would lead the community of Troy questioning everything they thought they knew about friendship, betrayal, and love. But the truth, when it finally came to light, would turn everything upside down, revealing a secret so dark, so unexpected, that no one could have predicted the real killer hiding in plain sight. What no one could have predicted, not even Betsy herself, was how this growing sense of distance would pull her into a dangerous web, one spun by a woman she trusted completely, Pam Hupp. Pam Hupp was no stranger to Betsy. The two had been close friends for years, almost inseparable. In fact, Betsy often confided in Pam about her troubles in her marriage to Russ, their financial struggles, and the difficulties of raising two teenagers. Pam, in turn, was always there with a listening ear, offering advice and support. To the outside world, their friendship seemed genuine, even ideal. But over time, Pam had developed a much darker interest in Betsy's life than anyone realized. Pam's involvement in Betsy's life wasn't just as a friend. She had become a fixture in the Faria household. She often visited the Farias' home, spending time with Betsy while Russ was at work. And while Betsy confided in Pam about her marriage, Pam began forming a plan of her own, one that no one could have imagined. It wasn't long before Pam's motivations became less about friendship and more about something far more sinister. In the months leading up to Betsy's murder, there were subtle shifts in Pam's behavior. She became more insistent, more involved in Betsy's personal life. Her attempts to bond with Russ seemed genuine on the surface, but there was something unsettling about it. She would make comments about how unhappy Betsy seemed, offering unsolicited advice on how to handle their marital issues, suggesting that Russ was the problem. But it was clear to anyone who paid attention that Pam wasn't just concerned about Betsy's marriage. She was concerned about herself. Then came the shocking revelation Pam had been having an affair with Russ Faria. It was a secret that would shake the very foundation of the Farias' world, though neither Russ nor Betsy knew at first. Pam had manipulated her way into the Farias' lives, offering false friendship while secretly luring Russ into an emotional affair. As Betsy's marriage became strained, Pam's manipulation grew. And as she became closer to Russ, she began planting seeds of doubt in his mind about his wife, even suggesting that maybe he didn't truly understand what Betsy wanted or needed. The line between friend and foe had blurred. Pam was no longer just a well-meaning confidant. She had become a dangerous player in a game of manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. In the days leading up to Betsy's death, she began sensing something was wrong. While she had always been close to Pam, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to their relationship than met the eye. Betsy had always trusted Pam, but trust is a fragile thing, and once it's broken, it's hard to ignore the cracks. Betsy began distancing herself from Pam, but not enough to cut her out completely. She still leaned on Pam for support, still sought her advice in difficult times. But now there was a tension between them, a wariness that hadn't been there before. Betsy had no idea how much danger she was truly in. Pam's growing obsession with Russ was about to cross a line that no one could have predicted. She wasn't just trying to take Betsy's place in their marriage. She was willing to go much, much further. And as the walls closed in around Betsy, Pam's true intentions would finally become clear. But no one could have imagined the violent turn that Pam's hidden feelings would take. Betsy had no idea that the woman she thought was her friend had been plotting her death for months, quietly building the foundation of a plan that would ultimately lead to her own tragic end. And on the night of December 27th, 2011, the web of lies, betrayal, and manipulation would come to a deadly climax. It was a cold winter evening in December 2011 when everything changed. Betsy Faria, just 42 years old, would never come home from her evening out. What seemed like an ordinary night, a night she had planned to spend with friends, would quickly spiral into an unthinkable tragedy that no one could have foreseen. That's up. That evening, Betsy had told Russ she was going to a friend's house for a girls' night out. She had been feeling stressed, her marriage to Russ strained under the weight of their personal issues. It wasn't unusual for her to take a break from the pressures of family life, to spend time with a close friend, to just unwind. But as the night wore on, something felt off. Russ tried calling Betsy several times but received no answer. Initially, he thought little of it. Perhaps she was just having a good time. Maybe her phone had died. But as hours passed, unease began to settle in. By 9:30 p.m., Russ could no longer ignore the growing feeling of dread. The thought that something was wrong gnawed at him. He made a few more attempts to reach her, but the phone rang unanswered. It wasn't until 10:30 p.m. when Russ received the call that would irrevocably alter his life forever. It was a call from the police. A voice, calm but cold, informed him that his wife was dead. "Your wife is dead, sir. She's been murdered." The words hung in the air, impossibly heavy, a blow that left him reeling. He could barely process the news. How? Why? Who could have done this to Betsy? The shock was paralyzing. When Russ arrived at their home, a chilling sight awaited him. Police cars lined the street, their lights flashing against the dark sky, illuminating the cold, quiet neighborhood. As he stepped inside the house, he was confronted with a crime scene that would haunt him forever. Betsy lay in the living room, her body surrounded by a pool of blood. She had been brutally stabbed. Multiple times, leaving no question that her death was violent and personal. The officers told him she had died from severe blunt force trauma and multiple stab wounds. Russ was in a daze. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. He stood there, looking at the lifeless form of his wife, unable to wrap his mind around the brutal reality. His mind raced. Who would do this to her? Who would take Betsy's life so violently? And why? Had someone broken into their home? Was it a robbery gone wrong? Nothing made sense. As the investigation began, it quickly became clear that there was no sign of forced entry. Nothing in the house appeared to be stolen or disturbed. In fact, the scene seemed strangely intimate, almost as though the killer had been someone who knew Betsy, someone close to her, someone who had no fear of being caught in such a personal act. The first suspect, of course, was Russ himself. After all, this was the classic scenario: a husband, a wife, a murder. The police couldn't ignore the fact that Russ was the last person to see his wife alive. In the heat of the investigation, officers questioned him relentlessly, looking for inconsistencies in his story, something that would reveal his guilt. But Russ's responses were consistent. He had no idea who could have killed Betsy. Russ was grief-stricken and confused, yet the police did not rule him out. At the time, no one suspected anyone else. They looked for signs of motive. Was there infidelity? Financial trouble? But everything pointed back to Russ, the man at the center of the storm. And with that, the investigation took its first tragic turn. Russ Faria became the primary suspect in his wife's murder. As the police continued their work, one detail stood out. Betsy's close friend, Pam Hupp, had been in touch with her multiple times in the days leading up to her death. In fact, Pam had been the last person Betsy spoke to before leaving for her ill-fated night out. The same Pam who had spent so much time with Betsy in the weeks before the murder, who had become a regular visitor in the Faria household. But it wasn't until much later, after a series of twists and turns, that the truth would begin to emerge. A truth that would not only exonerate Russ Faria, but also unravel a disturbing conspiracy that would take years to uncover. For now, however, the investigation was still in its early stages, and as the officers scoured the crime scene, they would soon realize they were not dealing with a simple case of murder. The mystery of Betsy Faria's death had only just begun to unfold. And as the case took its twists and turns, one question loomed larger than ever. What was the real motive behind this brutal crime? Russ Faria had just been told that his wife was dead, her life violently taken from her in the sanctity of their home. The shock of the discovery was overwhelming. But what came next was something even more unimaginable. Russ was now the prime suspect in his wife's murder. The police didn't waste any time. Within hours of discovering Betsy's body, investigators began to turn their attention to Russ. They claimed it was a classic case of a husband killing his wife, the most obvious suspect in any domestic murder. Russ had been the last person to see Betsy alive, and there were some small pieces of circumstantial evidence that made him look guilty. The most significant piece of evidence was a 911 call made by Russ himself, in which he was heard telling the dispatcher that he had found Betsy's body. Some saw this as suspicious. Why was Russ so calm in the face of such a brutal murder? And then there were the details about their marriage. Russ and Betsy had been experiencing some marital issues, though there was no concrete evidence that pointed directly to him as the murderer. Still, the police kept pushing him, questioning him repeatedly. Russ, who had loved his wife, couldn't believe that the investigation was now centered on him. But the officers were relentless, and eventually Russ was arrested for Betsy's murder. He was charged with first-degree murder and set to stand trial. The case against Russ was largely built on the assumption that a husband, angry at his wife, had killed her in a moment of rage. The prosecution pointed to the strained nature of their marriage and suggested that Russ had killed Betsy in some sort of domestic dispute. However, there was little hard evidence to support this theory. As Russ sat behind bars awaiting trial, the truth was far from clear. But one thing became increasingly evident to anyone who was paying close attention. The real story of Betsy's death was still hidden in the shadows. The investigation had gone off track, focusing too narrowly on Russ and failing to explore other possibilities. Enter Pam Hupp. Pam, who had been one of the last people to see Betsy alive, seemed to have no trouble playing the role of concerned friend in the aftermath of the murder. She was quick to speak with investigators, offering her own theories about what happened. But Pam's involvement was more than just that of a concerned friend. She quickly inserted herself into the investigation, all the while carefully steering suspicion away from herself. Pam seemed to thrive in the chaos surrounding the murder, offering herself up as a resource for the Faria family and even making herself the point person for the investigation. She insisted that Russ was guilty, offering up statements about his supposed violent tendencies and alleged issues within their marriage. But despite Pam's constant presence in the investigation, something about her behavior began to raise eyebrows. Her eagerness to push Russ as the prime suspect seemed off. And then something remarkable happened. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the pieces weren't adding up. Russ had no motive. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime. His alibi was solid, and the investigation soon began to reveal cracks in the story that Pam had been weaving. In the months following the murder, the case seemed to stall. But then, in a twist that would send shockwaves through the legal system, an anonymous tip led to the discovery of a critical piece of evidence that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Pam Hupp. The closer investigators looked at her, the more it became clear that she had been lying, manipulating, and hiding something. What seemed like a concerned friend was in fact the mastermind behind Betsy's murder. The truth would soon come to light. Pam Hupp had killed Betsy Faria. As new evidence came to light and the case against Russ fell apart, it became clear that he had been wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. The story that had been told, that Russ had murdered his wife in cold blood, was shattered. It was Pam, not Russ, who had orchestrated this tragic and deadly plot. The discovery of Pam's involvement in Betsy's murder would eventually lead to the unraveling of a dark conspiracy, one that had been hidden in plain sight. But even as the truth emerged, the damage had already been done. Russ had spent more than 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, his life irreparably altered by the miscarriage of justice. As the case continued to unfold, the true horror of Betsy Faria's death and the betrayal by someone she had called a friend would leave a permanent scar on everyone involved. Russ Faria's trial was a grim affair. As the days passed, the weight of the evidence against him seemed overwhelming. The prosecution painted a picture of a troubled marriage, of a man who had snapped under the pressure and killed his wife. The most damning evidence they presented was the testimony of the police, who insisted that Russ's calm demeanor after discovering his wife's body was indicative of guilt. They also highlighted his conflicting statements during questioning, suggesting he was hiding something. Despite his fervent denials of involvement, Russ found himself trapped in a legal nightmare. The court seemed to accept the prosecution's theory that he had killed Betsy in a fit of rage, staging the scene to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. With little physical evidence to the contrary, and Russ's own behavior under scrutiny, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder in 2013. Russ was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He sat in his cell, utterly devastated. He had lost his wife, his freedom, and now his entire future. Yet, deep down, Russ believed one thing with absolute certainty. He had not killed Betsy. He knew he had been wrongfully convicted. He refused to give up fighting for the truth. But the truth was elusive. As Russ languished in prison, the real story behind Betsy's murder was just beginning to unfold. The breakthrough came years later, in 2015, when Russ's attorneys began to dig deeper into the case. The more they investigated, the more they realized that the key to Betsy's murder might not lie with Russ at all. In fact, it seemed to point towards someone who had been close to Betsy, a woman who had been a seemingly trustworthy friend, Pam Hupp. Pam had always been a prominent figure in Betsy's life, but there was something unsettling about her involvement in the aftermath of the murder. She had acted almost too calm, too eager to insert herself into the investigation. And in the years following Betsy's death, Pam's own behavior began to raise red flags. Pam Hupp's name surfaced again when it was revealed that she had been involved in a previous case, the suspicious death of another elderly woman, 79-year-old Louis Gumpenberger, in 2016. Pam had claimed that she shot Louis in self-defense after he had attempted to kidnap her, but investigators found numerous inconsistencies in her story. The circumstances surrounding Louis's death mirrored a myriad of oddities in Betsy's case. As detectives re-examined the murder of Betsy Faria, they discovered startling new evidence. Pam Hupp had been the last person to see Betsy alive. The investigation soon revealed that Pam's motivations were far darker than anyone had imagined. It turned out that Pam had been in a secret, long-running affair with Russ, Betsy's husband. But even more shocking was the discovery that Pam had been secretly plotting to kill Betsy all along. She had orchestrated the murder in a twisted attempt to frame Russ and gain control of Betsy's life insurance money, as well as to solidify her position in the Faria family. In 2016, after new evidence surfaced, Russ's conviction was overturned. He was released from prison after serving almost 3 years for a crime he didn't commit. The joy of freedom was bittersweet, however, as Russ struggled with the years of emotional and psychological damage caused by his wrongful conviction. In 2019, Pam Hupp was charged with the murder of Betsy Faria. But the drama didn't end there. As the case gained national attention, the public learned more about Pam's dangerous, manipulative nature. She had successfully fooled those closest to Betsy for years, hiding her dark intentions behind a mask of friendship and concern. Her trial would later reveal even more disturbing truths, and in 2021, she was convicted of Betsy Faria's murder. Russ Faria, finally exonerated, was left to rebuild his life. He had lost years of his life behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, but he took solace in knowing that the truth had come out. The death of his wife, however, would forever haunt him, because even though Pam was finally held accountable, the cost of truth was immeasurable. Russ' case had become a symbol of the fragility of justice, and it brought to light the devastating consequences of a wrongful conviction. The search for answers had uncovered a hidden world of deception, betrayal, and manipulation. But for Russ Faria, the hardest part was yet to come, trying to find peace in the wake of the tragedy, knowing that sometimes the truth takes years to surface, and the scars left by a lie may never fully heal.